Hello, everyone. Welcome to our English conversation program. How are you? I hope you are fine. Since this is the first Saturday, I'm very happy to invite you to join me for the guest hour. Here with me is
Beth Higgins again, and hello everyone. It's a pleasure to be here with you.
the guest for this month is Mr. Nishiyama, who happens to be a special consultant to the Sony Corporation.
And he's widely known as one of Japan's top simultaneous interpreters. Let's listen to what he has to say.
Well, it's a great honor and privilege for us to have you on our program, Mr. Nishiyama, today.
Well, it's also an honor for me to be here, Professor Togo and Miss Higgins. And hello, everyone.
Well, I'm especially happy to have the pleasure of meeting you today, Mr. Nishiyama, because probably you don't remember me, but when I was a student at Waseda some 20 years ago, I heard you speak to us when you came to our campus accompanying Ambassador Reischauer.
Oh, is that so?
And naturally, our Waseda students enjoyed listening to you, and I still remember how you served as an interpreter for the ambassador, and I was very impressed with the ambassador's talk and at the same time your interpreting. So may I begin, Mr. Nishiyama, by asking how you came to work for Ambassador Reischauer at the American Embassy?
Since I was working in the American Embassy, Ambassador Reischauer used to call upon me to interpret for him each time that he went out to give a public lecture or hold press conferences. So I had the privilege of interpreting for him many times. And it was through that experience that I got to know the ambassador very well.
I'd like to ask you something about your education, because I understand that it was in the physical sciences and not in the humanities. So could you tell us a little about your education?
Yes, I was graduated from the University of Utah in the United States, having majored in electrical engineering, and then I spent 2 more years in graduate school studying physics, receiving my master's in physics. And so, therefore, my original profession, so to speak, or my work was in electronics.
And after studying engineering and physics, you started off your career as an engineer, but then could I ask how you became interested in interpreting?
Well, this is a portion of my personal history, but if I may be allowed to express a little bit about that, I was working in a Japanese government laboratory in research.
In the States?
No, here in Japan, in Tokyo. I arrived here in Japan in 1934, and I became a Japanese citizen in 1935, and started working in a Japanese government laboratory, and was here all through the war in Tokyo. And so when Japan surrendered and the occupation came in, I was asked to go to the occupation headquarters to assist in various matters involved with electronics and telecommunications, such as the telephone and telegraph system in Japan. And so therefore, in that capacity, I had to do a considerable amount of interpreting between the Japanese authorities and the occupation authorities in the field of telephone and telegraph services, research, and so forth.
So your knowledge of, say, engineering and physics certainly helped you with interpreting that.
Yes, at that time it was a great help.
And then I'd like to ask you again something about your education, because although your nationality is Japanese, you were educated in the United States. Could you explain that?
Yes, I was born and brought up in the United States. And so therefore, all of my formal education from primary school through junior high school and high school and then university and then graduate school took place all in the United States.
I see.
And so therefore, my background is very American, but that was a long time ago. And Then my father died at that time, and so my mother and I brought his ashes back here to Japan. And that was in 1934. And of course, that was the time of the great worldwide depression. And even in the United States, as well as here in Japan, university graduates found it very difficult to find employment. For the younger generation nowadays, this might seem a bit odd that university graduates find it difficult to find employment, but that was true. And but however, I was fortunate in the fact that through a relative of mine, I was introduced to this Japanese government laboratory, and they hired me. And so I started working in the field of communication and electronics research in this laboratory. And that has been my background of coming here and working in this field.
Excuse me. So you were born in the United States and grew up there, and with total American or English education, I mean, in terms of the media of the education you received, our listeners are wondering how you learned your Japanese, because our listeners are having a hard time studying English, but probably in your case you had a great deal of difficulty learning Japanese.
Absolutely. However, I was fortunate in one respect, and that was that although I was born in the United States, my mother brought me to Japan when I was very young, when I was only 2.5 years old. And we were here in Japan for a year and a half. Now, a little child between the age of 2.5 to 4 is at the age period when the child begins to speak.
Exactly.
And at about the age of 4, the child starts speaking very fluently. And so my first language, my first spoken language was Japanese. And then we went back to the United States. And so at home, my parents constantly spoke to me only in Japanese.
So that you won't forget your Japanese.
That's right. And also my mother and father were both very strict about the kind of Japanese I spoke, so that I was trained into speaking a courteous form of Japanese. And so I retained that spoken language at home while I acquired a native familiarity with the English language. Then, after coming back here to Japan once again, after finishing the university and graduate school, and going into this laboratory, which was a Japanese government institution, I had to be able to read and write Japanese as well as speak it like a native. And so therefore, I had to sit down and learn how to read and write Japanese. And it was an interesting process. I learned the kanji. Fortunately, I was able to read the kana characters. But the kanji characters, I had to look up in the kanji dictionary by counting the number of strokes, and then learn how to read the kanji, and then I would go to a Japanese-English dictionary to find out what the word meant. And going through this rather tedious process helped me a great deal to retain in my memory the meaning of each of these kanji and how to read them. After about 3 or 4 years, I was able then to write Japanese almost as well as a native Japanese. So I was writing technical papers and writing patent applications and various government forms and documents in Japanese.
So you suddenly learned Japanese the hard way.
Oh, yes. But if one wants to learn a language, one has to be willing to work hard.
That's a good piece of advice for our listeners.
I understand that you're a member of PEN, the Japanese PEN Club, and I'd I'd like to ask you about that. In fact, I understand you're on the board of directors.
Well, yes, I am one of the members on the board. But PEN, P-E-N, stands for Poets, Editors and Essayists, and Novelists.
Oh.
And it is an organization of writers, not only in Japan, but throughout the entire world. There are many pen centers and pen clubs in various nations throughout the world. And the membership, of course, includes many famous writers, too. And here in Japan, of course, the very famous writers are also members of this pen club of Japan.
Mm-hmm.
Next year, we will be having an international congress of the pen here in Tokyo.
Mm-hmm.
And now we are in the process of preparing for it.
And symbolically, of course, a pen indicates something to write with. Am I right?
That's right. And so, in a sense, this represents what might be called the power of the pen.
Uh-huh. The pen is mightier than the sword.
That's right, that's right. And the purpose of the International Pen is to foster freedom of expression
Mm-hmm.
and the exchange of culture and literature amongst the various nations,
Mm-hmm.
and form a sound basis, a cultural basis on which the nations can get along together.
May I ask you about what kind of writing you yourself do?
I write articles and books on various aspects of what is often called cross-cultural communications, which means, of course, the problems and matters related to communicating between one culture to another. And most of my writing has been in the Japanese language. I have written some articles in English. I am right now working on a book in English now, which I hope will be published in the United States some months ahead.
Well, I'm sure you are very much occupied, but if you have any, say, free time at all, what did you find yourself doing? You know, I mean, in terms of your hobbies.
Oh, I see. Well, tennis is my hobby,
Oh.
and whenever I can get some time, especially on weekends,
Mm-hmm.
I go out to my tennis club and play tennis. It's a great game.
Mm-hmm. And did you start playing tennis a long time ago when you were in school, or did you go in for it, say, after you became, so to speak, in the middle age?
Yes, well, in a more serious way, I took up tennis when I was quite old.
Mm-hmm.
As a matter of fact, I played a little bit of tennis before the war.
Mm-hmm.
And then when the war came on, World War II, that is, there were no tennis balls. And so we couldn't play tennis, you see. And so I stopped playing for perhaps about 30 years.
Mm-hmm.
And then it was after I had reached about the age of 62 that I joined a club and started playing again. And now I'm taking up the game quite seriously.
You must be in good condition then.
Well, at present, fortunately, I do feel very well, yes.
Well, Mr. Nishiyama, I really hate to say this, but time is almost up, and we have to say goodbye. But for the second half of this program, I would like you to come again and share some of your professional experiences with our listeners.
Yes, I'm sure they're eager to find out about what you've done in your job.
Well, it's going to be another occasion of great pleasure to be back here again, and I'm looking forward to it.
Thank you.
Well, everybody, this concludes today's guest hour, and be sure to join us again. Till then, bye-bye.
Goodbye till next week.
Goodbye.
Hello, everyone. Welcome to our English conversation program. I'm very happy to be back to present you the second half of the April guest hour together with
Beth Higgins. Hello, everybody. It's a great pleasure to be here today and to have in the studio with us Mr. Sen Nishiyama, who I think you know is one of Japan's most famous simultaneous interpreters, and he's currently serving as a special consultant to the Sony Corporation. A very special welcome back to the second half of this month's guest hour.
Thank you.
And we'd like to summarize a little bit last week's discussion before we begin this week's interview. We learned last week that Mr. Nishiyama was schooled in the United States, and that after his formal education, he came to Japan and began to live and work here, and he totally mastered the Japanese language, and I must say I'm very, very envious that he's bilingual.
Well, I wish I were too. And Mr. Nishiyama, today I'd like to start off by asking what, in your opinion, is the primary responsibility of an interpreter?
The primary responsibility of an interpreter is to transmit in a different language, that is the language of another country, the information that is expressed by the speaker.
So you're not supposed to put in any personal feelings
No, sir.
whatsoever?
No, and the idea is to receive what the speaker has said in its total information, in all of its detail, and also then express that in the other language in an equal amount of detail with as closely an accurate rendition of that information as possible. But that does not mean word for word interpreting.
That makes the whole thing even more difficult. And then if the speaker gets excited, then the interpreter should excited as well?
The interpreter perhaps emotionally should not get excited, but nevertheless should be able to express in a voice that indicates this excitement.
Well, I suppose among your many experiences in interpreting, that the Apollo experience was certainly one of the most unforgettable times.
Oh, yes.
Could you tell us something about that event?
Oh, that was a tremendous event. As a matter of fact, the Apollo flights began, at least as far as the broadcasting on television was concerned in Japan. It began in the autumn of 1968 with Apollo 7, and it went right on through to Apollo 17 in 1972. The most famous one, of course, was Apollo 11, which landed on the moon. And I must say that was a most exciting week or 10 days here in the studio of NHK.
And I'm sure you must have used a lot of, say, special terms.
Oh, yes.
Which I'm afraid were difficult for, say, the layman.
Not only just the layman, for everyone, because the terms, even in the English language, were new terms. Because there was never such a piece of equipment such as the Apollo spacecraft, you see, before. So there were many new terms in the English language. So naturally, we had to work out similar terms in the Japanese language. And so I discussed this with the staff of the NHK station and also with the science commentator, Mr. Kenya Murano, who covered all of those programs. And we had to work out in Japanese terms.
So you must have coined some new words.
Well, a number of terms were coined at that time in Japanese, yes.
And
excuse me, but they had to be terms that would be immediately understandable in the Japanese language when the average television viewer heard the term.
Oh.
For example, in English, we had the term lunar module. Now, the lunar module is that portion of the spacecraft that actually landed on the moon and then took off from the moon back to Earth. But in Japanese, if I may be allowed to use some Japanese here, we called it the Tsuki Chakuriku Sen. So that just by that Japanese term, everybody would understand what it meant. Yes.
That's interesting. Well, to change the subject slightly, Mr. Nishiyama, there's a great deal of talk about cross-cultural communication these days, and they say the mere knowledge of English is not sufficient to achieve successful communication with Americans or any other English-speaking people. And could you elaborate on this point a little bit?
Yes, I might illustrate it with one or two examples. One is, of course, that even if one feels that he or she knows the English language and the equivalents that are in English from Japanese, if we take a word such as 理解しました or わかりました and if we translate that as I understand or that I am able to understand this, in English the word understand usually means that the person has heard the information and recognizes the information, and not necessarily agree with the information. Whereas in Japanese, oftentimes if we say that the person has been able to likai this thing, in other words, よく理解しました as an example, that would imply that at the same time that one understood the information, one also tacitly agrees with the information. So there is a difference there. Or take the word sumimasen.
Yes.
We use the word sumimasen in Japanese for many occasions. Sometimes it is an apology. At other times it is an expression of appreciation for something that has been done for you. But if we translate that literally as I'm sorry or excuse me, it carries a completely different meaning in English, because I'm sorry is actually an apology and only an apology.
So I'm sure that in this process of trying to translate, sometimes misunderstandings arise because of some kind of cultural rooted background. In these terms, I suppose there's some young listeners who are interested in becoming simultaneous interpreters. So do you have advice for our young listeners of how to become proficient and how to handle these problems as you seem to do so well?
Well, if you'll allow me a little bit of time to explain, I shall try to in the few minutes that we have. Number one, especially if the person is a Japanese wishing to become a simultaneous interpreter or an interpreter per se. Number one, I think the person must be able to speak correct Japanese.
Oh, Japanese or English?
English as well, but especially since he is a Japanese or she is a Japanese, that person must start with that person's native language, which is Japanese, and be able to speak it correctly and fluently and in complete sentences, not half sentences, which are so easy to say in Japanese. Sentences without the subject, for example, can be complete sentences in Japanese. But one must be able to express oneself very clearly and accurately in Japanese. At the same time, of course, the person must become bilingual in the sense of being able to speak English or some other foreign language equally as fluently as one's own native language. Then, of course, one must have a broad background of knowledge. Those are what might be called the prerequisites, the basic requirements for becoming an interpreter. Then, the interpreter in training must be able to express what someone else has said accurately and not express what he or she is thinking. In other words, we usually speak only our own thoughts. When we listen to someone else, we hear that person and get a general idea of what that person is saying. But the whole attitude of the mind is reversed. One is then totally attentive to what is being said by the speaker in all of its detail, all of the details of the expression and the information. And then one must be able to express that so that one must not edit, one must not comment on it, but one must express it accurately. Again, I say not word for word, because that is not the way to do it, but to express it in the most natural form in the other language.
I'd like to ask you sort of a backwards question. If you were to walk into a group of students, a classroom, and you were to immediately omit some students as unqualified to become simultaneous interpreters, what type of behavior or language pattern would you immediately say, no chance?
Well, if it were just language patterns, I would ask the student to come up to the platform and give a 5-minute talk on his or her favorite hobby and see how fluent, lucid, or clear and well that person can express those ideas.
Mm-hmm. It may sound easy, but actually it must be very difficult to do, huh?
Well, usually young people, and I used to be this way myself when I was young. Usually young people only express their own native language in terms of conversations with other friends. And so they speak in little bits and pieces and wait for the other side to respond or to urge the person to go on. And then we speak a little bit more. And that is the way that conversation is usually carried out in normal social occasions. And that is usually the level of language that we are familiar with. But that will not suffice. That will not do in interpreting.
And could I just ask one more thing about the technical aspect of interpreting and the term simultaneous interpretation seems to me in such a common use, but how does it differ from, say, another type of interpreting?
Yes, well, simultaneous interpreting is, of course, what the term implies, which is that when the speaker starts speaking, the interpreter, just a few moments later, will start interpreting. And as the interpreter is interpreting, the interpreter is listening also to the information that is coming into the ear, you see, and so the interpreter continues on this way. In consecutive interpreting, the speaker speaks a bit and then allows the interpreter to interpret. Then the speaker speaks again and the interpreter interprets.
And which is more difficult, I wonder?
It depends on how long the speaker speaks. If the speaker is giving a lecture, for example, and speaks, let us say, the equivalent of a whole relatively long paragraph, and then allows the interpreter to interpret, that form of consecutive interpreting is more difficult than simultaneous interpreting. And the reason for this is that the listener expects consecutive interpreting to be almost perfect in sentence formation and also very fluent with no hesitation whatsoever. Whereas in simultaneous interpreting, of course, the sentence formation may be a bit odd, but the listener gives
some allowance
for this, as long as the information is understood.
I'd like to ask you if you have any hints for our listeners who are all trying to learn the English language of how to express themselves effectively in English.
Well, I would say that that is the same as learning how to express oneself clearly in one's own native language, myself. But it takes a lot of good, hard work and study of all kinds, reading, writing, and speaking.
In constant practice?
And constant practice, yes. After all, if you are learning a sport, you constantly practice to get your form just exactly right. And the same thing should be true with language, which in a sense is a physical exercise as well as a mental exercise, just like sports is.
Well, Mr. Nishiyama, I'm sorry to interrupt you, but that's all the time we have today. And thank you very much indeed for being with us. And I'm sure our listeners found your talk so helpful and interesting.
Well, thank you very much, and it's been a real privilege and pleasure.
Everybody, this concludes today's guest hour. So long.
Goodbye, everyone.
Goodbye.